Hey team, all right, welcome back. Let's get ready for our next phylum, Phylum Arthropoda. So the arthropods, these are commonly known as the insects. These are the most common group within Phylum Arthropoda. Crustaceans would also be in here as well, scorpions, spiders, things of that nature. But this phylum, this is part of Subphylum Ecdysozoa. So if you remember what ecdysozoans, that means that they have an exoskeleton made of chitin that they need to shed, they need to get rid of in order to grow into a larger state. Okay. Subphylum Ecdysozoa includes the arthropods as well as the other group, the nematodes, Phylum Nematoda. Okay. So this group arthropod, so let's think about what that word means. Arth. What's another word that we know that starts with that root? Arth, like arthritis. So that's an inflammation of the joints, right? And then pod, we've seen pod before. It means foot. So the name arthropoda means jointed foot. And this is one of the things that this group is famous for, is the fact that they have limbs, they have appendages that are jointed. This was the first group to evolve this idea of a jointed appendage that they can move around. And those jointed appendages are really helpful for movement both on land as well as in water. They're moving along the bottom of the ocean or swimming, right? This group also has segmentation. It presents with segmentation, the metamerism, like we saw with the annelid. So it's going to have repeated body segments with maybe some differentiation of the limbs that are attached to that body segment or specialization of the segments, but that's those repeating units that we're going to see. More than 80% of all described animals are arthropods. They were the first animals to live on land, right? So they were the first animals to colonize land. And they colonized land, we think about 450 million years ago. And it would have been right after or right around the time that the first land plants started to colonize land as well. So the reason that they are so successful on land is because they have that exoskeleton, which prevents desiccation, and those jointed paired appendages as well. So this group, again, they have that exoskeleton that's made of chitin. They also have an open circulatory system. So we still don't see a closed circulatory system yet. So that means that they have hemolymph that flows into their hemocoel. So they don't have true blood. The lymph would be the fluid that they use to circulate through. All right, and we'll talk, as we get into some of these groups, we'll talk more specifically about how each group, its traits of respiration and other unique traits of that group. So now we're going to move through and talk about the different subphylum within Phylum Arthropoda. Subphylum Chelicerata, so these include things like the scorpions, mites, spiders, as well as horseshoe crabs would be in this group as well. All right, they are named for the chelicerae, the feeding appendages that they have around their mouth. So in this group, the only appendages that they have before their mouth are the chelicerae. In other groups, they might have more than just that set of feeding appendages. And these chelicerae are adapted for lots of different functions. In spiders, often they can deliver venom, but they're also used to grind up food and then secrete digestive enzymes into the food, because a lot of these organisms cannot consume solid food. They consume liquidized food. And so like a spider is going to catch something in its web, is going to wrap it in its silk. And this is going to inject digestive juices, so that way it basically liquefies it, and so that way it can slurp it up, because they do not have a digestive system that can expand to make space for that solid food. This group, they are venomous, the scorpions, and some spiders are venomous. We think that trait of being venomous evolved independently a couple or a few times. And the unique thing about spiders are the only group that we know of in all of the animal kingdom that can produce silk, and they use the silk obviously for building webs, so that way they can catch prey. Sometimes they can also do what's called spider ballooning, which there's lots of fun videos on YouTube if you want to see what that is. That's how spiders, they can use their silk to kind of fly through the air. And then how they breathe depends on their environment. So marine species like the horseshoe crab, so how they breathe depends on their environment. So horseshoe crabs are going to breathe through gills that are on the underside, on the belly of the horseshoe crab. Terrestrial species are typically going to have book lungs, like spiders use book lungs, which are folds of tissue that are folded up like pages of a book, as well as potentially some trachea. So tubes that are extending to the outside environment that allow air to move in. So they don't have lungs necessarily like we do that they can expand and then bring in. They have these little trachea tubes that connect to the outside environment, which allows for gas exchange to come into the body. Right? Okay, so the next phylum is going to be Subphylum Myriapoda. So these are the millipedes and centipedes are in this group. So we think fossilized evidence indicates that one of the first arthropods would have looked something like a millipede. These ones up here, so they don't actually have 1,000 legs. They only have, millipedes have 2 legs per segment. Oh, excuse me, 2 pairs of legs per segment. And they are herbivorous, and there are lots of repeating segments like this, right? Versus the centipedes have only 1 leg per segment. They are also carnivorous, the centipedes are. And they also have a pair of venomous claws that they can use to catch their prey, and then they stab those prey with those claws, those appendages, and that they'll paralyze their prey, so that way it's easier to consume them. Alright, so this is Subphylum Myriapoda. Millipedes, 2 pairs, herbivorous. Centipedes, 1 pair of legs, and carnivorous. And then we're going to jump into what's called the Clade Pancrustacea. This is a recent addition to the arthropod family. This clade represents a new phylogenetic relationship between insects and crustaceans that has recently come to light, meaning that we used to talk about Subphylum Crustacea and Subphylum Hexapoda. Now there's evidence that they're much more closely related to each other than we thought before. So that's what Clade Pancrustacea is indicating, is a close relationship between crustaceans and insects. So Subphylum Crustacea, so these are the marine arthropods typically. These include things like the crustaceans, crabs, lobsters, barnacles, shrimps, things like that. I like to call them the insects of the ocean, if you will, though they're not technically insects. The crustaceans are usually the ones that we eat. If we are eating marine arthropods, we're typically going to be eating the crustaceans, especially crab, lobster, and shrimp. Also in the crustacean group, we have the isopods. This one right down here. You might know them as roly-polies. Right? Those are actually part of the Subphylum Crustacea. And that name isopod means same leg, right? So if we look at their legs, we don't really see any differentiation between them. Versus in a lot of other arthropod species, you see highly adapted, highly different morphological characteristics to these different appendages, right? But in isopods, most of their appendages are basically the same. The decapods, these would be things that tend to have 10 legs, like their name implies. Things like crabs, right? They have highly specialized appendages for many different functions, and their cuticles are typically hardened by calcium carbonate. So that's why if you've ever tried to eat crab, like break into a crab leg, you have to usually use those special silverware pieces. I don't know the name of them. The tools, special tools to break into the crab leg, because their chitinous exoskeleton has been hardened by calcium carbonate. And then the copepods are also in this group as well. They are a major member of plankton, of the plankton layer, in both marine and freshwater environments. They are either herbivorous or carnivorous, and they are a major food source for a lot of organisms that are filter feeding. And here we go, Subphylum Hexapoda. So Subphylum Hexapoda, these are the true insects, and insects are really only rare in marine environments, because that's where you find the crustaceans, right? So these were the first animals that we think were to live on land, were the insects. Even though the first insects we think looked like the millipedes, we think the true animals, the first animals to live on land would have been the hexapoda. These were also the first animals to fly. We think that flight evolved, our best guess is somewhere between 359 and 252 million years ago. And what's cool about their flight, as opposed to other organisms that can fly, like we'll see later, especially in the birds, they don't have to sacrifice the use of any of their appendages in order to also fly, because their wings are extensions of their exoskeleton, of their cuticle. So they can have all of their legs, and they can have wings, and they can fly. So there's more than 30 orders within the subphylum. It's a very diverse group. There's more species known of these insects, of Subphylum Hexapoda, than the rest of all the eukaryote groups combined. So we're really living in a world that's ruled by insects and plants, if you think about it. And their evolution, their trajectory on land, follows very closely right behind plants. So as the first known vascular plants started to colonize land, they could exist in that area because they were the first insects were likely herbivorous. And then as we have the vascular plants, the seedless vascular plants started to expand out, insects would have followed them, and so on and so forth. So one very common characteristic of Hexapoda is metamorphosis, and all of Arthropoda as well is some sort of metamorphosis, incomplete versus complete metamorphosis. In complete metamorphosis, we have a distinct larval stage, and then they go through some sort of actual transition. Like in the butterfly, they're going to go through the cocoon, and then they transition into their adult stage, right? So this would be complete metamorphosis, where the juvenile stages are morphologically distinct, and they live in different habitats and eat different food compared to the adult stage. Versus an incomplete metamorphosis, it's what we call nymphal stages. This adult stage right here looks very similar to these ones as down here as well. So they're very similar morphologically, but if we notice, we don't have wings until the adult stage, right? So each of these nymphal stages, they're growing, they're increasing in size, they're molting between each of these stages, but it isn't until the adult stage where they are actually sexually reproductive, right? And same thing over here with the complete metamorphosis. They're not sexually reproductive until their adult stage either, but they're distinctly different in their adult stage versus their larval stages down here. So here's a sped up time lapse of complete metamorphosis of a monarch butterfly. So we've skipped over the larval stage and we're looking at the cocoon stage, the pupae stage, and how it's coming out of that cocoon. Pretty cool. A really quick overview of some of the orders in Hexapoda. Those that have complete metamorphosis, Coleoptera, those are the beetles. They have 2 sets of wings, incredibly diverse, 350,000 species just of those, right? Compare that to what we talked about with the angiosperms, right? It's crazy. Diptera, these are the flies and mosquitoes. They typically have 1 set of wings for flying, another set for balancing, and their mouth parts are adapted for piercing into something and then sucking out. Like a mosquito is going to pierce into our skin and then suck out our blood, right? Hymenoptera, these are the ants, wasps, the bees. These are incredibly social. Many of them are also eusocial, meaning they're living in colonies and only certain members can reproduce, others are workers. And they're known for building really elaborate nests, whether an ant nest or a paper wasp or something like that. And typically, a lot of times, the females will have stingers on their abdomen. Lepidoptera, these are the moths and butterflies. These have a proboscis that is adapted for feeding on nectar and diving into flowers a lot of times. So these ones have complete metamorphosis, so they're going to have a distinct larval stage and adult stage. These 2 groups over here, Hemiptera and Orthoptera, they have incomplete metamorphosis, so they're going to go through this series of nymphal stages. And each species goes through a different number of nymphal stages. So the Hemiptera, these are the quote-unquote true bugs, things like stink bugs, bed bugs. They tend to have 2 pairs of wings. One is going to be leathery, one is going to be membranous. And the leathery ones kind of cover over the membranous ones to protect them. And the Orthoptera, these are things like grasshoppers and crickets, things of that nature. They tend to be mostly herbivorous. They have large hind legs that are adapted for jumping and hopping. And a lot of times members of this group can make courtship sounds by rubbing their hind legs together. So their hind legs have ridges on them and they can rub them together, and that's what creates that cricket sound, the chirping. That is Phylum Arthropoda. So that is Phylum Arthropoda. They're known for having jointed appendages, an exoskeleton made of chitin, and segmentation. And they're one of the most diverse groups of animals on our planet. Good work.